The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as officers Marcus and Graham cruised down the busy downtown area, the streets alive with people going about their daily business, the scent of fresh coffee wafting from nearby cafes, the sound of chatter and footsteps filling the air. The officers passed by a bustling crowd, unaware of the tension that was about to unfold. It was a typical afternoon for them, nothing out of the ordinary, just another shift, another set of routine checks and tickets. As they drove along the block, when suddenly something caught Marcus's eye. He glanced to the right and spotted a woman walking briskly down the sidewalk, dressed in a dark professional outfit, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her pace was quick but calculated, as if she had somewhere important to be, but something about her movement caught his attention, the way she walked with purpose, the way her eyes darted across the street, her focus sharp and unyielding. She didn't seem like someone who had time to break the rules, but something inside Marcus told him to take a second look. Graham followed Marcus's gaze and frowned, raising an eyebrow. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he muttered under his breath. The two exchanged a look before Marcus made the decision to pull over the patrol car, gliding to a stop near the woman's path. They both got out of the car, Marcus adjusting his uniform as Graham stepped forward, taking the lead with his usual confidence. The woman continued walking, unaware of the approaching officers, her movements fluid and natural. "Excuse me, ma'am," Graham called out, his voice clear and demanding. The woman slowed her pace for a moment, but didn't stop. She glanced over her shoulder, then looked ahead again, ignoring his call at first. Marcus exchanged a brief glance with Graham, who was now walking closer to the woman. He called out again, more firmly, "Ma'am, we need to speak to you for a moment." This time the woman stopped. She turned slowly to face the officers, her eyes scanning their faces, a slight tilt of her head before her lips parted. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm, but with an underlying note of caution. She hadn't missed the tension in their approach, but she wasn't afraid. She stood tall and poised, waiting for an explanation. Marcus took the lead this time, stepping forward with a little more force in his voice. "We need to check your identification. Ma'am, you're walking in an area where jaywalking is common. We need to make sure you're not breaking any laws." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Marcus and then Graham, her gaze unwavering, as if weighing their words. She didn't seem fazed by their presence, but the coldness in her eyes suggested that she wasn't easily intimidated. "I'm sorry, officer, but I haven't broken any laws," she said with quiet authority, her voice calm. But her stance was unyielding. She glanced around as if searching for some kind of sign or indicator, but none came. The street was still busy with pedestrians, cars moving along the road, but nothing about the scene screamed danger or illicit behavior. Graham was taken aback by her response. He expected more hesitation, more compliance, but she stood there unmoved, and still he looked at Marcus, unsure of how to proceed. But Marcus was already too far gone in his determination to prove a point. "Ma'am, you need to step aside so we can check your ID," he ordered, his tone growing sterner. The woman remained silent for a beat before taking a step back, her posture still straight, her hands by her sides. But she wasn't moving as they asked. She wasn't backing down, not yet, not until they could explain why she was being detained in the first place. The woman remained still, her eyes unwavering as she assessed the officers before her. Her body language didn't change, not a single muscle moved, as if she was a statue carved from stone. She stood firm, waiting for them to clarify exactly what was happening, but Marcus was growing impatient and Graham wasn't far behind. Both officers exchanged a look before Marcus stepped forward again, his tone more forceful now. "Ma'am, we're not asking here. You need to comply with our orders and show us your identification," he said, each word deliberate and stern. The woman's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him, as if she was challenging his authority in front of the street full of people who were now starting to notice the confrontation. She finally spoke. Her voice was measured with a cool edge that stopped both officers in their tracks. "I am not required to show you anything without knowing the specific reason for this stop," she said, her words slow and deliberate, almost as if she were explaining the concept of respect to them, as if it were something foreign to their understanding. She continued to stand her ground, eyes locked on Marcus, but there was a subtle shift in her posture. Now her shoulders were squared and her chin lifted just a fraction, as if she was waiting for the officers to understand the severity of their misstep. Graham felt the tension rising, but he wasn't sure how to handle it. There was a growing unease in the air, like an invisible pressure pressing in on him. He glanced at Marcus, who was still fixated on the woman, both men now surrounded by the murmuring crowd that had gathered at a distance to watch the unfolding scene. There were whispers and stares, people slowly pulling out their phones, capturing the moment, hoping to document whatever was happening on the street corner. "I said step aside," Marcus repeated, but his voice faltered just a little. His patience was wearing thin. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. He looked to Graham for backup, but Graham remained silent, unsure of how to proceed. As the woman took a slow step back, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the officers, she wasn't backing down, she wasn't giving in, she was simply standing her ground. And in that moment, something shifted. It was as if the energy between the three of them changed. The tension simmered beneath the surface, but nothing had broken yet. "I'm asking you again, officer, what is the reason for this stop?" she said, her voice steady and cold. She hadn't raised it, but there was an undeniable force behind her words. It was clear that she wasn't just some random passerby. She had experience in handling situations like this. She knew exactly what to say and when to say it, and that made Marcus hesitate for just a moment. He glanced at Graham again, who stood frozen, unsure of how to continue. The woman's gaze never wavered. She wasn't afraid of the situation. She was in control in a way that made Marcus uncomfortable. It was as if she were challenging not just their authority but their understanding of it. At that moment, just as the tension seemed poised to explode, the sound of footsteps interrupted the standoff. A figure appeared from the crowd, moving swiftly toward them, a commanding presence that shifted the atmosphere entirely. The figure that approached was a woman dressed in a sharp uniform, her stride purposeful and confident. As she moved toward the scene, the crowd parted slightly as she walked past the onlookers, her presence undeniable. The officers didn't notice her at first, too focused on the woman in front of them, who had yet to comply with their demands. The new arrival stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning the situation with a professional gaze. As her sharp heels clipped against the pavement, she paused for a moment, taking in the scene, and then spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" Her tone was authoritative but calm. It was a question, but there was an underlying command in her words that made both officers stop dead in their tracks. Marcus and Graham turned toward her, their faces a mixture of surprise and confusion. The woman, who had been standing so composed just moments ago, remained still, her gaze shifting slightly to acknowledge the newcomer, but she said nothing. Her silence was an intentional power move, one that only made the officers more uneasy as they realized they didn't know who this woman was. Captain Collins stood there for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation in front of her. The officers' demeanor, their behavior, all of it struck her as off-base. She recognized immediately that something wasn't right about how this interaction was unfolding, but she remained silent, watching the officers stumble over their words as they tried to explain themselves. Both Graham and Marcus stammered, trying to piece together their explanations, but they failed to make sense of it all. The situation was escalating faster than they could control it. But Captain Collins wasn't fazed. She wasn't even moved by the tension. She was used to handling situations like this. She knew how to take control and how to bring order to chaos. "Is there a reason you're detaining this woman?" Captain Collins asked, her voice now firm with a hint of confusion. The officers blinked as if the question didn't make sense to them. They didn't understand the gravity of the situation, not yet. Marcus finally managed to mumble an explanation. "She's been walking suspiciously. We thought she was jaywalking," he said, still trying to make sense of the situation. But as he spoke, he felt the weight of his words and realized how ridiculous they sounded. Captain Collins raised an eyebrow. She wasn't convinced. "Jaywalking," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the words before dismissing them entirely. "You think this woman," she nodded toward the woman standing tall beside her, "was jaywalking?" The woman's calmness seemed to unsettle Marcus even more. He could feel the sweat beginning to gather at the back of his neck as he struggled to piece together a valid reason for the stop. But Captain Collins wasn't waiting for an answer. She turned to the woman beside her with a knowing glance. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. The woman nodded without speaking, still composed, but her eyes now seemed to soften just a bit. She was still clearly angry, but she didn't want to escalate things further. Captain Collins looked back at the officers, her expression hardening. She knew something was off, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she gave the officers a moment to reflect on what they had just done. The silence between Captain Collins and the officers stretched out as they stood there waiting for something to happen. The air felt thick with tension, but neither side made a move. Marcus felt the weight of his mistake hanging in the air, the embarrassment creeping into his chest, his gaze flickering to Graham, who was equally uncomfortable. Neither officer could quite grasp how they had ended up in this position, and yet they both knew they had made a mistake. Captain Collins stood motionless as she observed them, her gaze cold and calculating, as if she could see through their discomfort and into the core of the situation. She turned back to the woman still standing tall beside her, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Thank you for your patience," Captain Collins said, her voice now calm, but carrying an edge of authority. The woman nodded, but didn't speak. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered or caught off guard. She was above that. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes remained sharp like a predator watching her prey. Captain Collins addressed the officers again, her voice stern as she spoke to Marcus and Graham, her words firm, but laced with a warning. I don't know what you thought was going on here, but I suggest you take a moment and reflect on your actions. The officers exchanged another glance, this time one of shame, as they realized just how badly they had misjudged the situation, their faces flushed with humiliation as Captain Collins continued. This is not how we do things here. You're supposed to be protecting and serving the public, not causing unnecessary tension for no reason. Her words hit like a slap to the face, but it was the truth, and both officers knew it. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to defend his actions, but he knew deep down he couldn't. It was a weak excuse for their overzealous behavior, and both of them had missed the bigger picture. The woman standing beside Captain Collins wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She was someone far more important, someone with a higher rank than either of them could have imagined, but neither officer had taken the time to recognize her face or understand who she was before jumping to conclusions. Captain Collins looked at the woman again, her eyes narrowing in realization as the situation slowly began to make sense. She studied the woman's face for a moment longer before her lips parted slightly, and she turned her gaze back to the two officers. You don't recognize her, do you? She asked the question almost casually, but there was an underlying tension in her voice that made Marcus and Graham freeze. Both officers turned to look at the woman once more, but this time they saw something different in her eyes. There was an unmistakable authority in her gaze, a quiet power that neither had recognized before, but now it was clear. The woman's gaze flickered between the officers and Captain Collins, but she didn't speak, not yet. Her silence was deliberate. She knew the officers hadn't yet realized who she was, but she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She let the moment stretch on just long enough to let the full weight of the situation sink in for them before speaking quietly, her voice steady, but carrying a weight of its own. I am your superior, she said, each word deliberate and measured. The officers blinked as if the words had struck them like a bolt of lightning. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was thick as Captain Collins stood with a stern expression, watching the realization slowly dawn on Marcus and Graham, their faces drained of color as they processed her words. The woman standing next to Captain Collins was not just anyone. She wasn't a random passerby. She wasn't someone they could push around. She was their superior, the deputy chief of police. And now they understood the magnitude of their mistake. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Captain Collins didn't flinch at their stunned reactions, her gaze unwavering as she looked from one officer to the other. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what had just happened. Graham stood frozen next to him, his eyes wide as he looked between Captain Collins and the woman who had remained silent until now. The reality of the situation settled over them like a heavy weight. They had just tried to arrest their boss. The woman remained calm beside Captain Collins, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she stood there waiting for the officers to regain their composure. But she wasn't offering them any help. She wasn't going to make it easy for them to get out of this. She had already made her point clear. She had been underestimated because of her appearance, because of her gender, and because of her race, but now she wasn't going to let them forget that mistake anytime soon. Marcus finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak stammer. I'm sorry, we didn't know." His words were almost a whisper, but they were filled with embarrassment. He was trying to salvage some semblance of respect. But it was too late. The woman's eyes didn't soften in response to his apology. Instead, they remained cold and distant as she took a step forward. "You didn't know," she repeated, her voice steady, laced with disbelief. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" She didn't wait for an answer. She continued to speak with a calm authority that made both officers feel small. "You assumed, because I was walking down the street, I was breaking the law. You didn't bother to ask who I was or what I was doing. And now you've put both yourselves and the department in a position where you're going to have to answer for your actions." She paused, letting her words sink in before she continued. "Your actions weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of how deeply ingrained bias can affect the way we see others." The words stung Marcus and Graham. Both of them stood there feeling the weight of her condemnation. They wanted to argue, they wanted to defend themselves, but they knew there was nothing they could say to undo what had already happened. They had made a judgment based on nothing but assumptions, and now they were paying the price for it. Captain Collins didn't look at them. She was focused on the woman standing next to her, her superior, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her eyes were steady as she observed the officers. Her silence was deliberate. She didn't need to say anything more. They both knew exactly what they had done. The woman finally spoke, her voice low, but filled with authority. "I don't want an apology," she said, her words firm. "I want you both to learn from this. I want you to take this moment and understand what it means to treat people with respect regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. She turned slightly to Captain Collins, who nodded in agreement. The weight of the words hung in the air, and Marcus and Graham could feel the sting of their actions sinking deeper into their consciousness. Their faces reddened with the shame of their mistake. The realization that they had made a snap judgment without any real cause was overwhelming. They had failed to consider the larger picture. They had failed to see the woman standing before them, not just as a person, but as someone deserving of respect and fairness. Captain Collins looked at the two officers for a long moment, her gaze piercing and unwavering. She had seen this kind of thing before, officers acting out of line or making assumptions based on biases they didn't even realize they carried. She had been working in law enforcement long enough to know that these things weren't just isolated incidents, they were systemic problems that needed to be addressed head-on. But she also knew that this wasn't a time for reprimanding them too harshly. This was a moment for them to reflect on their behavior, to understand the impact of their actions. She took a deep breath and spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "This is a teachable moment," she said, her words deliberate and measured. "And I hope you're both paying attention, because what happens here today will follow you for the rest of your careers. You have to own up to your mistakes and work to change the way you view the world around you." She paused and turned to the woman standing silently by her side, her eyes softening just a little. "And I want to thank you for your patience and grace in this situation." The woman nodded but said nothing, her gaze still strong and unwavering. She had already made her point. She didn't need to add anything more. The two officers stood silently, unsure of how to respond. They both felt a mixture of guilt and frustration at themselves, but also a certain sense of embarrassment at how they had handled things up until this point. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "We're sorry," he said, the words heavy with regret. "We didn't mean to overstep or assume anything about you." He glanced at the woman beside Captain Collins, but couldn't quite meet her eyes. "We just acted without thinking." Graham nodded beside him, not saying anything, but his expression mirrored Marcus's regret. The woman turned her gaze toward them, now her eyes sharp, but not unkind. She gave them a long look as if considering their apology. Before she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Your apology is a start," she said, "but it's only the beginning. You both have a lot of work to do to understand why you acted the way you did, why you felt entitled to treat me this way, and how you can make sure it never happens again." She turned to Captain Collins, who nodded in agreement. "This is the kind of thing we have to address in our training programs and in our daily work. We can't afford to overlook it." She said, her tone now more resolute. "We need officers who understand the importance of fairness and respect in every interaction, no matter who the person is or how they look." The woman stepped back then and gave them one last look. "I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for accountability," she said before turning away, leaving Marcus and Graham to stand there processing everything they had just heard. They were humbled, but also shaken as they realized that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. As the woman turned and began to walk away with Captain Collins beside her, Marcus and Graham stood in silence, watching them leave, the weight of the conversation still pressing heavily on their shoulders. Both men felt like they had been caught in a moment they couldn't easily escape from. They had been forced to confront their own biases, their assumptions, and their inability to recognize the person standing right in front of them. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed not only the woman they had wrongfully detained, but also himself and the badge he wore. He had always prided himself on doing the right thing, always following the rules, but in this moment he realized how easily he could fall into the trap of prejudice, how easily he could forget the core principles of fairness that had been drilled into him since the beginning of his career. He glanced at Graham, who was still standing beside him, looking just as lost in his thoughts as Marcus was. Both men now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Neither of them had ever imagined that they would find themselves in this position, much less with their superior officer reprimanding them for their behavior. "I don't know, man," Graham said, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't know how we could have messed up like that." Marcus sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck as he struggled to find the right words. "We got too caught up in the routine, too focused on the small stuff," he said. "We saw her walking down the street and just assumed she was doing something wrong. We didn't even stop to think maybe we should ask first." His voice trailed off as he realized how foolish it had all been. Graham nodded but didn't speak, his thoughts clearly racing as he tried to understand how he had missed the signs, how he had been so quick to judge. He had never considered that the woman might be someone important, that she might be someone he should respect on sight. That now that he knew who she was, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of regret that swept over him. He had treated her like any other person on the street without knowing who she was, without understanding that there was much more to her than met the eye. Marcus looked up at the sky as the crowd began to disperse. The people who had been watching the scene from a distance were now moving on with their day, their lives unaffected by what had just transpired. That Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they would remember this moment the way he would for a long time to come. He had always known the importance of doing the right thing, but today he had learned a hard lesson about assumption and bias, about the consequences of jumping to conclusions without considering the bigger picture. As the last of the crowd disappeared from view, Captain Collins and the woman walked a few steps ahead before Captain Collins turned back to face the officers one last time. "Take a minute," she said, her voice softer now. "Let's still carrying weight. Think about everything we've discussed and remember what this is really about." She paused and looked at both men with a piercing gaze. "You're here to serve and protect everyone, no exceptions, no matter who they are or what they look like." She gave them one final nod and turned to continue walking with the woman, leading Marcus and Graham standing in the quiet aftermath of their mistake. They both stood there for a moment longer, their heads heavy with reflection, unsure of how to move forward, but knowing deep down that they had just experienced something that would stay with them forever. Marcus and Graham stood there for a while longer, watching as Captain Collins and the woman disappeared down the street. Neither of them knew what to say next or what to think. They were still processing everything that had happened, still reeling from the realization of their mistake. And the weight of the lesson they had just learned. The hum of the city around them felt distant as they remained frozen in place, trying to gather their thoughts. The crowd had dispersed, but the echoes of their own failure lingered in the air. Graham was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe we did that," he said, shaking his head as if trying to shake off the shame that had taken root inside of him. "I mean, how did we not recognize her?" he added with frustration, his eyes scanning the street as if expecting some sort of answer from the pavement. Marcus sighed deeply, rubbing his face with his hands. "I don't know, man. We just saw a woman on the street and jumped to conclusions. We didn't even think to ask. We didn't even stop to consider the possibility that she might be someone important." He paused for a moment, looking down at his boots, his mind still racing with the scene from earlier. "We were so focused on the small stuff that we missed the bigger picture." Graham nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, and now we've learned the hard way," he muttered under his breath, still unable to believe how easily they had fallen into the trap of assumption. "I feel like an idiot," he added, his voice laced with self-disgust. Marcus looked at him, then a deep sense of regret settling over him as he realized that Graham's feelings mirrored his own. "We both messed up," he said quietly. "We didn't even take the time to understand the situation before acting." His words were filled with a somber realization that made the guilt heavier with each passing second. They both knew they had crossed a line they hadn't been prepared for, and now they were left to face the consequences. Graham let out a long breath and turned to face Marcus, his eyes clouded with confusion and self-doubt. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the situation. He felt lost, uncertain of how to move forward from here. It wasn't just the mistake they had made that weighed on him, it was the realization of how deep-rooted their biases had been, how easily they had made assumptions about someone based solely on their appearance. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, lost in thought, trying to find the words to explain what was going through his mind. He had been trained to serve and protect, but in that moment he had failed to do either. He had failed to show the respect and fairness that the job demanded. He had failed to treat the woman in front of him as an equal, and now he was left to reckon with that failure. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We start by admitting we were wrong," he said firmly. "We need to own up to this. We can't just sweep it under the rug. We have to learn from it and make sure we don't make the same mistake again." He paused and looked at Graham. "We need to do better." Graham met his gaze and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we do better." The weight of their words hung in the air as they stood there together in the quiet aftermath of their actions. It wasn't going to be easy to move on from this, but they knew that they had to learn from it and use it as a stepping stone to becoming better officers and better people. The following day the mood at the precinct was different. Marcus and Graham both felt the shift as they walked through the doors, their heads down as they passed by their colleagues. They knew the others could sense something had changed, even if they didn't know exactly what had happened. The weight of their mistake still hung over them like a shadow. But today it was time to face the consequences they had been avoiding. The incident from the day before was still fresh in their minds, and it was clear that they couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. Captain Collins had called them both into her office first thing in the morning. The air inside the room felt colder than usual, the blinds drawn tightly shut as the two officers sat across from her, both of them feeling like they were about to face a firing squad. She had said nothing when they entered, only motioned for them to sit before turning her gaze back to the files on her desk. The silence between them was almost unbearable. but it was in that silence that Marcus and Graham realized they weren't going to be let off easy. After what felt like an eternity, Captain Collins finally spoke, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "I hope you two have had some time to reflect on your actions," she said, her words direct but measured. Marcus and Graham both nodded, but didn't say anything. They had no excuse for what they had done, no defense that could justify their behavior. "Yesterday was a mistake, a serious one," Captain Collins continued. "But it wasn't just a mistake in the way you handled the situation, it was a mistake in your thinking." She paused and looked at both of them. "You saw a woman on the street and immediately assumed she was in the wrong without even considering who she was or why she might be there." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Both Marcus and Graham flinched as they realized just how deeply their biases had shaped their actions. The truth was clear now. They hadn't seen the woman as a person, they had only seen what they assumed she was based on her appearance, and that assumption had led them down a dangerous path. Captain Collins leaned forward, then her eyes narrowing slightly. "You both have to understand that this job is about more than just enforcing the law. It's about understanding people and treating them with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their status." She let the words linger in the air for a moment, as if giving them time to process everything she was saying. "What happened yesterday was a wake-up call for you both, but it needs to be more than just a lesson in humility," she added. "It needs to be a turning point in the way you see the world and the way you interact with the people around you." Graham looked down at his hands, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of his knee. He could feel the weight of the captain's words pressing down on him, but he knew she was right. He had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment, and in doing so he had disrespected someone who deserved far better. Marcus sat beside him, still reeling from the same realization. Both men knew that this wasn't just about them, it was about the values they were supposed to uphold as officers of the law, and the responsibility they had to everyone they served. Captain Collins paused again and then spoke. "I'm going to be recommending some retraining for both of you," she said firmly. "This won't be easy, but it's necessary." She looked at them both one last time, her expression hardening. "I expect better from you both going forward, and I won't tolerate any more mistakes like the one you made yesterday. Do you understand?" Marcus and Graham nodded silently, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than anything else could have. The next few days felt like a blur for Marcus and Graham. The retraining sessions had been intense but necessary. They spent long hours with their colleagues going over everything from bias recognition to community engagement. They were required to attend workshops on how to approach situations with empathy and understanding, and how to see people for who they truly were instead of making snap judgments based on appearance or preconceived notions. It was difficult at first. Each session felt like a mirror being held up to their actions, forcing them to confront parts of themselves they had ignored for too long. In the evenings, Marcus would go home exhausted, but unable to shake the thoughts swirling in his head. The guilt of the previous day still lingered, but now it was paired with a sense of determination. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. He knew that what they had done wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger issue that needed to be addressed. He couldn't let it slide by. He had to change, he had to be better. Graham was feeling the same way. Every day was a reminder of how wrong they had been, but also a chance to prove to themselves and others that they could learn from their mistakes. He spent his nights reflecting on the woman's words and Captain Collins' final warning. He thought about how quick they had been to judge her without knowing anything about her. The shame that came with realizing how easily they had fallen into a trap of their own making weighed on him, but he was committed to doing better, to making sure that something like that never happened again. As the days passed, they started to notice the change within themselves and in the way their colleagues interacted with them. They weren't just being held accountable by their captain, they were being held accountable by their peers. There were no more laughs or casual jokes exchanged in the hallway when Marcus and Graham walked by, no more quick judgments whispered behind their backs. Instead, there was a new level of respect being offered to them as their colleagues saw that they were genuinely trying to change. The atmosphere at the precinct had shifted in a way neither of them expected. They weren't seen as the officers who had made a mistake. They were now seen as officers who were willing to grow and learn. It wasn't just about the retraining anymore, it was about the little things, the way they interacted with people on the street, the way they spoke to citizens with more patience and respect, the way they took a moment to listen before jumping into action. It was about remembering that every person they encountered had a story, a background, and a reason for being where they were, and that assumption was a dangerous game to play. One afternoon as they walked out of the precinct, Marcus glanced at Graham and smiled. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a victory, a sign that they were starting to find their way again. Graham returned the smile. "We're getting there, huh?" he said, his voice lighter than it had been in days. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, we are," he said with quiet confidence for the first time in a long while. They felt like they were on the right path. As they walked toward their patrol car, they saw a familiar face walking down the street, a woman with a briefcase in hand, dressed in a professional suit. Marcus and Graham both paused for a moment before continuing their walk, their eyes meeting and nodding subtly as they passed by. This time, there was no assumption, no rush to judgment, just a quiet understanding that not everything was as it seemed and that they were better for it. Weeks passed and the change within Marcus and Graham was undeniable. They had slowly but surely begun to rebuild their understanding of what it meant to serve and protect not just the law, but the people as well. They started showing up early for their shifts, volunteering for community outreach programs, and making more of an effort to engage with the people they encountered on patrol. They had learned to ask questions before making assumptions. They had learned that respect was not something that should be given based on appearance or status, but earned through how one treated others. The woman from that fateful day had become a symbol for both of them, someone who represented the larger problem they had failed to see before, someone who had been wronged by their actions but had shown them the path to becoming better officers. Despite the mistake they had made, she had remained dignified, calm, and unyielding even in the face of their ignorance, and now she was a reminder of the change they were striving for. One afternoon, as Marcus and Graham stood in the break room sipping their coffee and talking about the day's patrol, Captain Collins walked in, her expression unreadable, let her eyes scanning the two officers as if measuring them up. She had been watching their progress closely, and she had seen the efforts they had made to become better at what they did, to become better people. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed over her chest. "How's it going?" she asked casually, but there was an edge to her tone that told them she wasn't just asking about their patrols. She was asking about the bigger picture, about whether they had truly understood the lessons they had been taught. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Graham before responding. "Better," he said, his voice steady. "We've been working on it, and we're getting better. We've been doing outreach. We've been making an effort to connect with people." Before jumping to conclusions, he paused, unsure of how much detail to go into, but knowing that he had to be honest. "We've learned that we need to approach every situation with an open mind and without assumptions," he added. Captain Collins nodded slowly, her expression still unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, satisfaction maybe, or approval. It was hard to tell, but Marcus and Graham both knew they weren't out of the woods yet. They had done the work, but they still had to prove themselves each day. "You're on the right track," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but don't let your guard down just yet." She looked between them both as if weighing their sincerity. What happened before can't be undone, but it can be the foundation of something better if you continue to learn and grow from it. She paused for a moment before adding, "This job is about more than just enforcing the law. It's about understanding people and treating them with fairness no matter who they are." Her gaze lingered on them for a moment longer. "I expect that to remain at the forefront of your minds every time you step outside this building." Graham nodded, his voice soft. "We won't forget," he said, his words carrying the weight of everything they had learned in the weeks since the incident. Captain Collins gave them a brief nod and then turned to leave the break room, but before she stepped out, she looked back over her shoulder. "Remember this lesson, gentlemen," she said. "It's not just about policing. It's about being human." Marcus and Graham stood there in the silence that followed, their thoughts heavier than they had been in days. They had come a long way, but they both knew the road ahead wasn't easy. The change they had started would require constant effort. It would require them to check themselves every day to make sure they didn't slip back into old habits, but for the first time in a long time they felt like they were on the right path. The weeks that followed felt different for Marcus and Graham. They had made mistakes, but they were determined to use those mistakes as fuel for change. They woke up each day knowing they had to put in the work to improve themselves, and their approach to policing, the lessons they had learned through retraining and reflection, had become ingrained in them. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about being aware of their own biases and making sure they treated everyone with the dignity and respect they deserved. Their patrols were calmer now. They engaged more with the community, stopping to talk to people on the street, asking how their day was or if they needed help with anything. Their interactions were warmer, more genuine, and people seemed to notice the difference. There was still a sense of unease from some of the people they had once patrolled alongside, but slowly that unease turned into something else: respect. They had worked hard to rebuild their reputation, not just with their colleagues, but with the citizens they were supposed to protect and serve. One morning as they made their rounds, they encountered an elderly man sitting on a bench in the park. He was holding a cane and staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. Marcus and Graham both noticed him, but instead of continuing on their way, they slowed down and approached him. They had learned the importance of taking the time to check in with people, and this man was no different. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said, smiling warmly as he stepped up to the bench. "How's your day going?" The man looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly before he broke into a smile. "Oh, it's going all right, just enjoying the sunshine," he replied, his voice a little raspy but full of warmth. Graham smiled and leaned against the bench. "You come here often?" he asked as he looked around the park. "Every day," the man said with a chuckle. "There's something peaceful about this place, helps me think." The conversation continued for a few more minutes with Marcus and Graham both listening intently as the man talked about his life, his family, and his years spent working in the city. They had learned to listen without rushing to respond, to truly hear people, and that was something they had both come to appreciate during their time on patrol. As they said their goodbyes and walked away, the man waved after them, his smile still lingering. "Take care, boys," he called out. The moment was a small one, but it felt significant to Marcus and Graham. They had taken the time to connect with someone without rushing to judge or label them. They had treated him as a person with a story instead of just a stranger on the street. Later that day, as they were finishing their shift, Marcus turned to Graham with a thoughtful expression. "You think we're doing all right?" he asked, his voice low but genuine. Graham nodded. "Yeah, I think we are," he said with a small smile. "We're getting better each day." It was in moments like this that Marcus and Graham realized how far they had come. They weren't perfect, but they were better than they had been. They had learned that change wasn't something that happened overnight, but through consistent effort and reflection. They had learned to approach their work with empathy, understanding, and fairness, and as they walked off into the late afternoon sunlight, they knew they were on the right path. 1 year later, Marcus and Graham stood together once again in the same park where they had met the elderly man. They had seen countless faces in the time since their journey began, and with each face they encountered, they found themselves more open, more engaged, and more understanding than ever before. Their patrols had changed dramatically. They no longer saw themselves as enforcers of the law, only they saw themselves as protectors of the people. The community now saw them as part of the fabric of the neighborhood, as officers who cared not just about doing their job, but about the well-being of every person they interacted with. It had taken time, but they had earned the trust of the people they served. They had worked hard to shift their own perceptions, and had helped shift the perceptions of those around them. There were still days when they had to remind themselves not to fall back into old habits, days when the weight of their previous mistake threatened to cloud their judgment, but they had learned to check themselves and keep pushing forward. Marcus turned to Graham with a thoughtful expression as they walked down the same street where it had all begun. The memories of the incident still fresh in his mind, but the shame was gone, replaced by a quiet pride in the work they had done and the growth they had achieved. They had made a promise to themselves that they would never forget the lesson they had learned, but more importantly, they had promised to continue evolving, to always be better. Graham glanced over at his partner, noticing the change in him. "You good man?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said with a small smile, "just thinking about how far we've come, how much we've learned, how much we've changed." Graham smiled too. "Yeah, me too," he said as they walked side by side. The weight of their past mistakes had been replaced with the freedom of knowing they had done something important, of knowing that they had made amends and had worked to be better, not just for themselves, but for everyone they served. As they rounded the corner, they saw a familiar figure standing in the distance, the same woman they had once wrongly detained, standing in front of a local community center, talking with a group of people. She looked up as they approached and smiled, recognizing them instantly. Marcus and Graham stopped in front of her, their heads lowered in a quiet moment of respect. "Good to see you again," Marcus said, his voice sincere. The woman smiled warmly, her eyes sparkling. "It's good to see you both too," she said, her voice calm and steady, but there was something deeper in it, something that told Marcus and Graham that she had seen their growth too. They exchanged a few words about the changes in the community and the work the woman was doing at the center, and as they talked they realized just how far they had all come, how much had changed in the time since that fateful day when everything had seemed so wrong. Now everything felt right. As they parted ways, Marcus and Graham walked away feeling a quiet sense of peace. They knew the work wasn't over, but they had taken the first steps in the right direction, and they would keep moving forward. They had learned that change was hard, but it was worth it, and with each new day they would continue to grow and become the officers the community needed and the people they knew they could be.